Hey everyone, and welcome back. Tonight, we're going somewhere most historians refuse to look, not forward into humanity's future, but backward, far beyond the moment we supposedly began, into a time the ancient Sumerians recorded with such precision that it makes no sense unless they were documenting something real. Before we drift into this mystery together, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy these journeys into the deepest shadows of human memory. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your world right now. There's something beautiful about knowing we're all scattered across the globe, united by the same ancient questions, listening to the same whispers from clay that's been silent for 5,000 years. Now find your most comfortable position. Maybe dim the lights. Maybe let a fan hum softly in the background. Let the weight of the day drain away as we step together into the oldest mystery humanity ever wrote down. Because tonight, we're not asking who the Anunnaki were. We're asking what they were doing before we existed. And the answer is written in a document so strange, so impossibly detailed, that scholars have spent over a century trying to explain it away. They call it the Sumerian King List, and if you read it carefully, if you follow its numbers into the abyss of time they describe, you realize the Sumerians weren't recording the beginning of human civilization. They were recording what came before it. What the gods were doing in a world that had no humans yet, a world that shouldn't exist in any historical timeline we accept. But it's there, pressed into clay, preserved through fire and flood and the collapse of empires, waiting for us to finally understand what those ancient scribes were trying so desperately to tell us. The clay is cool in the archive, temperature controlled, humidity regulated, the silence so complete you can hear your own heartbeat. In a padded drawer, resting among dozens of fragments, lies a small clay prism. It's roughly the size of a coffee mug, though its corners have been worn smooth by time. 4 sides, each covered in columns of wedge-shaped marks pressed into the surface when the clay was still wet, still soft, still willing to remember. This object was created in the ancient city of Nippur, sometime around 2,100 years before the Common Era, but the scribe who made it wasn't inventing the text. He was copying it, faithfully reproducing words that were already ancient when his stylus touched clay. Words that had been copied and recopied for centuries before him, passed down through generations of scribes who understood they were preserving something sacred. The object is catalogue number WB 444. Scholars call it the Weld-Blundell Prism, named after the collector who eventually acquired it, but the Sumerians who created it had a simpler name. They called it a record of kingship, a chronological list of every ruler who had ever held power in the land between 2 rivers, stretching back to the moment when rulership itself first appeared. When Hermann Hilprecht first examined this prism in 1906, cataloguing fragments at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, he noticed something that made him pause. The text wasn't mythological poetry. It wasn't a hymn or a prayer. It was structured like a bureaucratic document. Name of king, name of city, length of reign. Next king, next city, next reign. Column after column, ruler after ruler, moving backward through time with administrative precision. But then he reached the beginning, and the numbers stopped making sense. The prism opens with a declaration that appears across every version of the king list ever found. After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Not after humans invented kingship, not after people learned to organize into hierarchies. After kingship descended from heaven. As if rulership itself was a gift, something that came from elsewhere. Something that existed before humans were ready to receive it. And then it names the first king, Alulim, who ruled in Eridu for 28,800 years. Read that number again slowly. 28,800 years, not 28 years, not 280 years, 28 millennia plus 8 centuries. A span of time longer than all of recorded human history. Longer than agriculture has existed, longer than cities, writing, civilization itself. One king, one reign, 28,800 years. Hilprecht must have checked his translation. He must have compared it against other copies, looking for errors. But every version of the king list, from every city where it's been found, says the same thing. Eridu, Lagash, Nippur, Ur, later Babylonian copies from Nineveh. They all agree. The first king ruled for an impossible length of time. And he wasn't alone. The second king of Eridu, Al-Algar, reigned for 36,000 years. The third king, Enmenluana, ruled for 43,200 years. The numbers don't decrease. They increase, as if time operated differently in those earliest ages, as if the world itself followed rules we no longer understand. 8 kings total ruled Eridu before kingship moved to the next city. Their combined reigns spanned 241,200 years. Then kingship shifted to Bad Tibira, where 3 more kings ruled for a combined 108,000 years. Then to Larak, where 1 king reigned for 28,800 years. Then to Sippar, where 1 king ruled for 21,000 years. Finally to Shuruppak, where 1 king governed for 18,600 years. 18 kings total, 5 cities, 456,000 years of history. And then, abruptly, the text pivots. A single line that changes everything. The flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven again, the kingship was in Kish. Everything changes after that line. The post-flood kings rule for centuries, maybe a millennium at most. Still exaggerated, still unlikely, but nothing like the impossible spans that came before. Etana of Kish reigns for 1,500 years, which is absurd but human-scaled. Meskiagasha of Uruk rules for 325 years. Gilgamesh, the famous hero, governs for 126 years. The numbers are still inflated, still legendary. But they've shifted into a different order of magnitude entirely. They've moved from cosmic time into mythological time, into something that approaches historical time. And scholars can trace the transition. Some of the later names match rulers whose inscriptions have been found, whose tombs have been excavated, whose historical existence is independently confirmed. So the standard interpretation became simple. The pre-flood section is pure mythology, symbolic ages, divine eras, poetic expression of cosmic principles. The post-flood section gradually transitions from legend to history. Somewhere in the middle, fantasy becomes fact. But that interpretation leaves fundamental questions unresolved. Questions that have haunted Sumerologists for over a century. Why would the Sumerians frame obvious mythology in the same format as reliable history? Their myths, stories of Gilgamesh battling Humbaba, of Inanna descending to the underworld, of Enki and Ninhursag creating humanity, don't pretend to be administrative records. They're clearly narrative. They're poetic. They're symbolic. They use the language of story. The king list uses the language of bureaucracy. Name, city, reign length, next. No embellishment, no drama, no poetic flourishes, just data, presented with the same dry precision you'd find in a tax record or census document. This is how the Sumerians recorded facts, not how they recorded myths. And why do the impossible numbers follow such precise mathematical patterns? In the 1960s, scholars began examining the pre-flood reign lengths more carefully. They noticed something remarkable. The numbers aren't random. They're not arbitrary estimates or symbolic approximations. They're exact multiples of a specific unit, a unit the Sumerians called the Shah. 1 Shah equals 3,600. It was one of their primary units for measuring vast time spans based on their sexagesimal mathematical system, the base 60 mathematics they used for everything from commerce to astronomy. And when you examine the pre-flood reigns, almost all of them are clean multiples of Shah. Alulim's 28,800 years equals 8 Shah exactly. Alalgar's 36,000 years equals 10 Shah. Enmenluana's 43,200 years equals 12 Shah. The pattern continues through most of the list, with occasional variations that still maintain mathematical relationships to the base unit. This precision suggests something profoundly different from mythology. When you see numbers that consistently hit exact mathematical benchmarks, you're not reading biography, you're reading calculation. You're looking at data that's been encoded using a specific system, preserved in numerical form because the original meaning had been lost, but the numbers themselves were considered too important to change. The Shah of 3,600 years is suspiciously close to certain long-term astronomical cycles. Not exact, but close enough that some scholars have proposed the king list might encode celestial observations spanning millennia. Continuous sky-watching that would require either institutional memory passed down through countless generations or inherited knowledge from earlier observers who tracked the heavens for purposes we can only guess at. Consider what 43,200 years represents, 12 complete Shah cycles. If this encodes something astronomical, perhaps related to the precession of the equinoxes, which takes roughly 25,920 years to complete, or multiple planetary conjunctions tracked over vast spans, then the king list isn't claiming Enmenluana lived for 12 Shah. It's claiming his era corresponded to 12 complete cosmic cycles. The text becomes a calendar, not a biography, a record of epochs, not individuals. A chronological system that measures time in astronomical periods rather than human lifespans. This reframing transforms everything. If the pre-flood section records epochs rather than lifespans, then the king list preserves a chronological framework that predates Sumerian civilization itself. It suggests that someone, somewhere, was tracking cosmic time long enough to recognize these cycles, long enough to understand that certain celestial patterns repeat, long enough to develop a mathematical system sophisticated enough to encode those patterns. And the Sumerians inherited this chronology rather than invented it. But here's what makes the king list truly extraordinary, truly strange, in a way that refuses to fit comfortably into any box labeled mythology or symbolic literature. The document explicitly divides history into two distinct periods, separated by a specific event. The flood. Everything before it follows one set of rules, operates on one scale of time. Everything after it follows different rules, operates on a human scale. The flood swept over. 5 words that mark the boundary between two worlds, between the age of cosmic time and the age of human time, between the period when kings reigned for Shah cycles and the period when kings reigned for lifetimes, between then and now, and we know the flood happened, not globally, not covering every mountain and drowning the entire earth, but within the boundaries of Mesopotamia, within the world the Sumerians knew. Archaeological evidence confirms that a catastrophic inundation struck multiple cities simultaneously around 2,900 years before the Common Era, exactly when the king list says it did. Leonard Woolley found it at Ur, a sterile clay layer over 2 meters thick, deposited between distinct occupation levels. Water-laid sediment containing no artifacts, no pottery, no charcoal, no evidence of human activity, just clean flood silt. And beneath that layer, another city, another culture, buried and forgotten until Woolley's team dug deep enough to find it. The same layer appears at Shuruppak, at Kish, at Eridu, cities separated by miles, all showing evidence of massive flooding at the same historical moment. Not gradual river overflow, not seasonal inundation. Catastrophic deposition from water moving with such force and volume that it scoured away everything in its path. The geological testimony aligns perfectly with the textual testimony. The King list describes the moment when continuity broke, when the world before ended and the world after began, and the mud confirms it. Something happened, something that divided Sumerian history into before and after, which means the King list isn't entirely mythology. At least part of it documents real events, real catastrophe, real rupture in civilizational continuity. And if the flood is real, if that dividing line between impossible rain lengths and merely exaggerated rain lengths corresponds to an actual historical event, then we have to ask a much more uncomfortable question. What if the pre-flood section is also documenting something real, not literal biographies of individuals who lived for millennia, but something else equally genuine? A record of what existed before humans dominated this land. A chronicle of the age when others ruled, when the Anunnaki walked the earth before we did. The document tells us explicitly what those 18 pre-flood kings were. It tells us where they came from. It tells us they weren't human. And it tells us exactly what they were doing for 456,000 years before the flood swept over and humanity began again. We just have to be willing to read what's actually written. In the silence of deep night, when the museum is empty and the archives breathe with the weight of millennia, imagine holding that clay prism. Imagine feeling its surface, slightly rough where the stylus pressed too hard, smooth where the scribe's hand steadied. Imagine reading those columns of cuneiform, following the lists of names backward through time, and imagine reaching the beginning, the moment before humans. The age the text describes with such bureaucratic precision that it can't be dismissed as pure fantasy. After kingship descended from heaven. That phrase appears twice in the king list, once at the very beginning, describing the first moment of rulership in Eridu, and again after the flood, describing kingship's restoration in Kish. The repetition is deliberate. It emphasizes continuity broken and then restored. A pattern interrupted by catastrophe, but resumed afterward according to the same principles. Kingship descended from heaven, not emerged from human organization, not developed through tribal leadership, not invented by early city-states experimenting with governance. Descended, came from elsewhere, arrived from outside the human sphere. The Sumerians were extraordinarily precise with their language. Their cuneiform script allowed for nuance, for subtle distinctions between similar concepts. When they said kingship descended from heaven, they meant something specific. They distinguished it from kingship rising from earth, or kingship emerging from humanity, or kingship being discovered through experience. Heaven, in Sumerian cosmology, wasn't just the sky. It was the realm of the divine, the sphere of the Anunnaki, the place where those who were not human dwelt and ruled before descending to organize the earth. And the first city to receive this descended kingship was Eridu, the oldest city, the sacred city, the city the Sumerians themselves considered the birthplace of civilization, the place where, according to their temple inscriptions, the foundations were laid in the sacred place, where ancient designs were carried forward from distant days. Eridu sits in southern Iraq, near what was once the shore of the Persian Gulf. Modern excavations have confirmed that it's among the very oldest urban settlements in Mesopotamia, with occupation layers stretching back to around 5,400 years before the Common Era. The city's patron deity was Enki, god of wisdom, fresh water, magic and crafts. His temple, the Iabzu, the house of the cosmic deep waters, was believed to be built directly over the primordial ocean that existed beneath all land. This wasn't symbolic geography. The Sumerians genuinely believed that beneath Eridu, beneath Enki's temple, lay the Abzu, the source of all fresh water, the cosmic reservoir from which every river and spring ultimately flowed. And they believed that connection made Eridu special. It was the axis point, the place where heaven, earth, and the waters below converged, the location where divine and earthly realms touched most directly. And this is where kingship first descended. The king list names Alulim as the first recipient. Alulim of Eridu, who ruled for 28,800 years. We know almost nothing else about him. No myths describe his deeds. No hymns praise his accomplishments. No temple inscriptions invoke his name. He exists only in the king list, at the very beginning, ruling for an impossible span from a city that would become the holiest site in Sumer. But the text tells us something crucial about him and the rulers who followed. It tells us they existed before the flood, before the catastrophe that reset everything, before humanity, as we know it, began to build the cities and temples and irrigation networks that would become Sumerian civilization. They ruled in a world that was organized differently, a world operating on cosmic time rather than human time. A world where those in power lived by different rules, measured their existence in Shah cycles rather than years, functioned according to principles we can barely imagine. What were they doing for all those millennia? The king list doesn't elaborate. It simply records names, cities, reign lengths. It documents that they existed, that they ruled, that they held power for vast spans before the waters came. But other Sumerian texts that describe the world before the flood, texts that preserve memories of what existed in those earliest ages, provide fragments of the answer. And what they describe is labor, cosmic labor, the work of organizing a planet. The Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest Sumerian creation narratives, describes the world at the very beginning, before cities existed, before humanity had been created, before agriculture, animal husbandry, or any form of civilized life. In those days, the text says, the land was not divided. The Euphrates and Tigris rivers had not been assigned their courses. Marshlands had not been established. Fields had not been organized. The world existed, but in a raw, unorganized state. Potential waiting to be actualized. And the gods, the Anunnaki, were tasked with the actualization, with transforming chaos into order, with making the earth habitable, productive, suitable for life. The Atrahasis epic, which we discussed before, contains the most detailed description of this pre-human work. It describes how the Igigi, the younger gods, the laborers of the divine hierarchy, dug irrigation channels. They dredged rivers to control flooding. They built the first temples. They established the infrastructure of civilization itself. For how long? The text says 40 years in some versions, but other versions say 3,600 years. One Shah, and they worked without rest, without relief, growing increasingly exhausted and resentful, until finally they rebelled, burning their tools and demanding that the elder gods find another solution. That's when humanity was created, as replacement laborers. To continue the work the Igigi could no longer endure. But before that rebellion, before humans existed, the labor was entirely divine. The Anunnaki and their subordinates were alone on Earth, transforming it, shaping it, preparing it. And if the king list is encoding actual epochs rather than individual lifespans, then that work continued not for one Shah, but for multiple Shah cycles, for the equivalent of tens of thousands of years, measured in astronomical rather than human terms. What does it mean to organize a planet? What does that work actually look like? The texts give us hints. They described the establishment of river courses, ensuring that the Tigris and Euphrates flowed properly, that their seasonal flooding was predictable and useful rather than chaotic and destructive. They described the creation of marshlands, those rich ecosystems where fresh and salt water mix, where fish and birds proliferate, where reeds grow thick for building and basket making. They described the division of land, the establishment of boundaries, the allocation of territories to specific deities who would oversee particular regions. Enki received the sweet waters, Enlil governed the air and storms, Ninhursag controlled the mountains and highlands, Utu managed the sun's course. Nana supervised the moon's phases, each domain assigned to a specific overseer. This is planetary management, resource allocation, ecosystem establishment. The creation of stable systems that would sustain life once life was introduced, and it took a very, very long time. The King list records that time, not in human years because humans didn't exist yet, but in cosmic cycles, in Shah measurements that encoded how long these processes required. 18 kings, representing 18 administrative periods, 18 phases of the great work that transformed raw earth into habitable world. And then, when the work was complete, when the planet was ready, humanity was created, fashioned from clay and divine essence, made to continue the labor the Igigi had abandoned, made to maintain what the Anunnaki had established. This is what the texts tell us the Anunnaki were doing before humans, preparing the world for us, building the infrastructure we would inherit, establishing the systems we would maintain, working for epochs measured in astronomical cycles to create the conditions under which human civilization could emerge. We call it mythology because the scale seems impossible, because we can't imagine projects that span tens of thousands of years, because our civilization, our recorded history, is so brief that such vast undertakings feel more like fiction than fact. But the Sumerians recorded it with bureaucratic precision. They preserved it across centuries of copying. They treated it as history, not as myth. And they divided it clearly from the human era that came after, marking the boundary with a flood that actually happened. What if they meant exactly what they said? What if the king list is testimony, not imagination? What if those 18 kings represent 18 epochs of pre-human earth management, recorded in the only numerical system the Sumerians had, preserved because someone understood that memory of what came before mattered? What if the Anunnaki's work, documented in administrative detail, is still visible in the landscape itself? The silence deepens. The archive breathes. And somewhere in the darkness, clay tablets wait with more pieces of the puzzle, more fragments of the story, more evidence of what happened before we existed. Let's keep reading. The mathematics won't let us look away. Once you notice the pattern, once you see how precisely the numbers align, you can't unsee it. And the pattern in the Sumerian king list isn't random. It's deliberate, calculated, encoded, 3,600, the Shah, the fundamental unit. And every single pre-flood rain, when you examine it closely, relates to this number. Not approximately, not roughly, exactly. Alulim rules for 8 Shah, Al-Algar rules for 10 Shah, Enmenluana rules for 12 Shah. The precision continues through the list with mathematical consistency that shouldn't exist if these numbers were merely mythological estimates or symbolic approximations. Scholars have proposed various explanations for why the Sumerians would choose 3,600 as their base unit for cosmic time. Some suggest it's purely mathematical convenience. 3,600 has many divisors. It can be divided evenly by numerous smaller numbers, making it practical for complex calculations. But other scholars have noticed something more intriguing. 3,600 years is suspiciously close to several significant astronomical cycles. Not exact, but close enough to be meaningful. The precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the position of the stars to shift gradually over time, takes approximately 25,920 years to complete one full cycle. Divide that by 7, and you get roughly 3,700 years, close to one Shah. Jupiter and Saturn, the two largest planets visible to ancient astronomers, have a conjunction cycle. They align in the sky, appearing close together from Earth's perspective, roughly every 20 years, but the location of those conjunctions against the background stars shifts over time. It takes approximately 794 years for the conjunctions to cycle through all 12 zodiacal constellations. Multiply that by a factor, and you approach Shah measurements. Venus, the planet most carefully tracked by Mesopotamian astronomers, has its own complex cycles. Its synodic period, the time between identical configurations as seen from Earth, is 584 days. Multiple Venus cycles compound into longer patterns that ancient astronomers recognized and recorded. The famous Venus tablets of Amisaduqa track these patterns across 21 years. Extend that observation across centuries, and you begin to recognize even longer periodicities. The Moon's nodal cycle, the time it takes for the Moon's orbit to precess fully, is approximately 18.6 years. Multiply that by specific factors, and you approach numbers that resonate with Shah mathematics. What if the Shah isn't arbitrary? What if it represents a genuine astronomical period that the Anunnaki recognized during their long work of planetary organization? What if tracking cosmic cycles was part of their task, essential to establishing the rhythms that would govern life on Earth? The Sumerians, inheriting this system, might not have fully understood its astronomical origins. They might have preserved the numbers faithfully, copied them generation after generation, because the numbers themselves were sacred, because they came from the time before, because they were part of the knowledge given by those who ruled before humans existed. The king list would then function as more than just a chronicle of rulers. It would be an astronomical record, a calendar measuring vast cycles of cosmic time. A document encoding knowledge about celestial mechanics that took millennia to accumulate. And if you read it that way, if you understand the reign lengths as epochs defined by astronomical cycles, the text transforms from impossible mythology into possible science. Ancient science, using different frameworks and different language than we do, but science nonetheless. Observation, measurement, pattern recognition, mathematical encoding. Alulim's 8 Shah reign becomes a period lasting 8 astronomical cycles. Alalgar's 10 Shah becomes 10 cycles. The text isn't claiming these were individuals who lived impossible lifespans. It's claiming these were eras, epochs, ages defined by cosmic periodicity. And specific Anunnaki oversaw each epoch, managing the work appropriate to that phase of planetary development. This interpretation makes the king list structure make sense. Why divide pre-flood history into 18 specific periods if you're just inventing mythology? Why not make it a round number, 20 or 30? Why not make it symbolic, 7 for completeness or 12 for the zodiac? 18 is specific, precise. It suggests genuine counting rather than symbolic approximation. And when you map those 18 periods against the total time span they represent, 456,000 years, and compare that to Earth's actual chronology, to the genuine history of climate change, glacial cycles, and environmental shifts over the past 500,000 years, some fascinating correlations appear. 456,000 years ago, Earth was in the middle of the Middle Pleistocene. The planet was experiencing cyclical glaciations, ice ages separated by warmer interglacial periods. Sea levels rose and fell by over 100 meters as ice sheets advanced and retreated. Coastlines shifted dramatically. River courses changed. The landscape itself was in flux. If anyone was attempting to organize that landscape, to establish stable systems for future habitation, they would need to work across multiple glacial cycles. They would need to track those cycles, understand their periodicity, wait for stable climatic conditions, and they would measure their work not in human generations, but in cosmic periods. The King List might be encoding exactly that, a record of pre-human Earth management spanning multiple climate cycles, multiple glacial periods, documented in Shah units, because that's how long the work actually took. This sounds like science fiction. It sounds like ancient astronaut theory. It sounds like the kind of speculation that serious scholars dismiss, but the difference is this: the Sumerians actually wrote it down. They actually recorded with administrative precision that kingship existed for 456,000 years before the flood. They actually preserved this chronology across centuries of copying. They actually treated it as factual history continuous with the post-flood period that we know is historically grounded. We're not inventing this narrative and projecting it onto ambiguous ancient texts. The Sumerians explicitly state that rulership existed, that civilization existed, that organized planetary management existed for almost 500,000 years before the catastrophe that reset everything. And they tell us who was doing that management, not humans, the Anunnaki, those who descended from heaven to organize the earth. The question isn't whether we believe in ancient astronauts or extraterrestrial intervention. The question is whether we're willing to take the Sumerians at their word, whether we're willing to entertain the possibility that they were recording something real, even if we don't yet understand what that reality was. Because if 456,000 years of pre-human history is mythology, it's the most peculiar, most precisely calculated, most consistently preserved mythology ever created. Or it's testimony, documentation, memory of what came before, encoded in the only numerical system available, preserved because someone understood that forgetting would be catastrophic. The clay doesn't lie. The mathematics don't lie. The chronology is there, pressed into tablets, copied across centuries, consistent across every version ever found. 18 kings, 456,000 years, the work of organizing a world, before humans existed to inherit it. That's what the King List tells us the Anunnaki were doing, and we've spent over a century insisting it must mean something else because the alternative is too strange. But strange isn't the same as impossible, and testimony isn't the same as myth. The archive is silent, but the numbers speak, and they're saying something we haven't wanted to hear until now. In the fragments, in the margins, in the texts that supplement the King List, we find more detail, more specifics about what those 18 epochs entailed, more evidence of the work that supposedly couldn't have happened. The Sumerian text called Enki and the World Order describes how Enki, after the creation of humanity, organized the functions of civilization. But the language is revealing. It doesn't describe Enki inventing these functions. It describes him assigning them, delegating them, distributing responsibilities that already existed. He called the assembly. He established the divine functions. He assigned the river courses. He appointed the grain goddess. He placed the cattle in their pens. He set the marshlands in order. This is delegation of established systems, not creation of new ones. The infrastructure already exists. Enki is assigning personnel to maintain it. And who built that infrastructure? When was it established? The text doesn't say explicitly, but the implication is clear. It happened before. In the time before humanity, in the age the King List documents, the age when the Anunnaki worked alone. Another text, the Eridu Genesis, describes the very oldest times, before cities, before temples, before any human habitation. And it says something remarkable. The land, Shuma, The princely land was established in purity, the people established in purity, the divine ordinances set in motion. Established by whom? The text doesn't specify humans, it doesn't describe human founders, it describes establishment, completion, finalization, passive constructions that imply the work was done by others, by those who came before. This is the consistent pattern across Sumerian literature. Humans don't invent civilization, humans inherit it. Humans maintain systems that were already functioning. Humans learn from teachers who already possess knowledge. Humans receive rather than discover, and those teachers, those earlier organizers, those possessors of prior knowledge, have names. The Anunnaki, the divine council, those who descended from heaven when kingship first came to earth. But here's what makes this even more intriguing, even more impossible to dismiss as mere mythology. The Sumerians weren't the only culture describing pre-human ages of immense duration. They weren't the only civilization preserving chronologies that extend far beyond our accepted timeline. Hindu chronology, recorded in the Puranas and other sacred texts, describes vast cycles of time called yugas. The current age, the Kali Yuga, began roughly 5,000 years ago. But before it came the Dvapara Yuga, lasting 864,000 years. Before that, the Treta Yuga, spanning 1,296,000 years, and before that, the Satya Yuga, the Golden Age, lasting 1,728,000 years. Total time span of the current Great Cycle, over 4 million years. And the texts describe multiple such cycles, stretching back into unimaginable antiquity. Egyptian chronology, according to temple records preserved by Manetho and other ancient historians, describes dynasties of gods ruling Egypt before human pharaohs. These divine dynasties supposedly ruled for tens of thousands of years, establishing the foundations of Egyptian civilization before humans took control. Plato, recording Egyptian traditions in his dialogues, mentions that Egyptian priests preserved records going back 9,000 years before Solon's time, roughly 11,500 years before present. And those priests told Solon that their own records referenced even earlier catastrophes, earlier civilizations, earlier ages that had risen and fallen before recorded history began. Mayan chronology uses a long count system measuring vast cycles of time. One Baktun equals approximately 400 years. 13 Baktuns equal one creation cycle, roughly 5,200 years. But Mayan inscriptions reference dates extending back millions of years into the past, describing previous creations, previous worlds, previous humanities that existed before our current age. These aren't isolated mythologies. They're global. They appear across continents, across cultures, across civilizations that had no contact with each other. And they all describe the same basic pattern: long ages before the present, immense time spans during which others, whether called gods, culture heroes, divine ancestors, or primordial teachers, organized the world and established civilization's foundations. Then catastrophe, usually flood, sometimes fire, occasionally both. A reset that destroyed the previous age and forced a new beginning. Then inheritance. The survivors preserving fragments of earlier knowledge, rebuilding based on what they remembered, carrying forward traditions and techniques that predated the catastrophe. This is the structure that appears everywhere. The same narrative repeated globally. Not because cultures borrowed from each other, but because they were all remembering the same events, filtered through different languages, adapted to different theologies, but fundamentally describing the same chronology. Long ages before. Catastrophe. Rebuilding after. The Sumerian king list isn't unique. It's just the oldest surviving written version. The first culture with sophisticated writing captured the oral traditions that every culture preserved. And they encoded it with mathematical precision because they were Sumerians, and Sumerians measured everything, but the memory is universal. 456,000 years might not be exact. The Shah calculations might be approximations. The correlation between Sumerian chronology and Hindu yugas might be coincidental, but the pattern is too consistent to ignore, too widespread to dismiss, too precisely preserved across too many independent traditions. Something happened before recorded history, something that involved organization, teaching, and establishment of civilizational foundations, something that ended catastrophically, something that humans inherited rather than invented. The King List documents Sumerian memory of that something. 18 rulers, 456,000 years, the age before the flood when the Anunnaki organized the earth. We can dismiss it as mythology. We can explain it as symbolic chronology. We can argue that ancient peoples simply inflated timescales because they lacked accurate historical frameworks. Or we can read what they actually wrote, with the understanding that testimony preserved across millennia, consistent across cultures, mathematically encoded with precision, might be telling us something true, something uncomfortable, something that doesn't fit our models, but something real. The work happened. The organization happened. The planetary management that prepared Earth for human habitation happened over vast timescales, measured in cycles we've forgotten how to read. And the Sumerians remembered. They wrote it down. They preserved it faithfully, that before we began, others were here, doing the work that made our existence possible. The archive breathes, the silence deepens, and in the darkness, more tablets wait. Let's see what else they recorded about the work that shouldn't exist. When you examine the individual kings, named in the pre-flood section, when you trace what little information survives about each one, patterns emerge that are even stranger than the impossible reign lengths. Because some of these names appear in other texts, and what those texts say about them reveals more about what the Anunnaki were actually doing. Enmenlu-Ana, the third king of Eridu, who ruled for 12 Shah, for 43,200 years, appears in astronomical texts. He's credited with receiving divine knowledge about the heavens. Specifically, he's described as the one who ascended, who was taken to the heavenly realm to receive wisdom about the stars, the planets, the cosmic order. The text says, he received the tablets of destiny, divine knowledge written on celestial tablets that contain the secrets of time, of fate, of the movements that govern all existence. He was shown the heavens, he learned the cosmic laws, and he brought that knowledge back to Earth. This isn't kingship in a normal political sense. This is astronomical training, scientific education, transfer of knowledge about celestial mechanics from those who understood them to a ruler tasked with implementing that understanding. And 12 Shah, 43,200 years, might represent how long it took to accumulate that astronomical knowledge. How many observation cycles were required to recognize all the patterns, to understand all the periodicities, to map the full complexity of planetary and stellar motions. You can't learn precession from short-term observation. You can't recognize the great cycles from watching the sky for decades or even centuries. You need millennia. You need continuous observation across geological timescales. You need records that span ice ages, and Enmenlu-Ana's reign represents that observation period. His era, his epoch, was the time when cosmic mechanics were being mapped, when the knowledge that would later govern agricultural cycles, religious festivals, and temple orientations was being accumulated. Another king, Dumuzid the Shepherd, appears in the king list as ruling Bad Tibira, but he appears elsewhere in Sumerian mythology as well. Dumuzid becomes a dying and rising god, associated with seasonal cycles, with vegetation that grows and dies and grows again, with the annual rhythm of planting and harvest. His mythology describes him as descending to the underworld for half the year, then returning to the surface for the other half, death and resurrection, absence and presence, the eternal cycle. This is agricultural allegory, the connection between rulership and seasonal management. Dumuzid's epoch might represent the period when annual cycles were being established, when the relationship between celestial movements and terrestrial growing seasons was being mapped, when the knowledge of when to plant and when to harvest was being discovered through observation and experiment. How long would that take? How many growing seasons would you need to observe to understand all the variables, soil conditions, water availability, temperature patterns, frost dates, optimal planting windows, thousands of seasons, tens of thousands, enough to see the patterns, to recognize the periodicities, to develop reliable agricultural science. Dumuzid's reign spans that discovery period. His era is the time when Earth's rhythms were being learned, when the knowledge that would make stable agriculture possible was being accumulated. Ensipa-Ziana, who ruled Larak for 8 Shah, 28,800 years, is mentioned in later texts as a healer, a physician king, one who understood the properties of plants, of minerals, of treatments for diseases and injuries. Medical knowledge doesn't emerge overnight. It requires generations of careful observation. Which plants heal? Which harm? In what combinations? At what doses? How do you treat infections, broken bones, fevers, wounds? The knowledge base is enormous, and it's all empirical. Trial and error, success and failure, gradual accumulation of what works. 28,800 years might represent how long that accumulation took. How many generations of healer observers were required to map the full pharmacological potential of Earth's biosphere, to test every plant, every mineral, every animal product, to develop the medical knowledge that Sumerian physicians would later inherit? Ensipa-Ziana's epoch is the age of medical discovery. His reign documents how long it took to transform random plant gathering into systematic medicine. Each king, each epoch, represents a specific phase of the work. Specific knowledge being accumulated, specific systems being established. The pre-flood age wasn't idle. It wasn't the gods simply existing in static perfection. It was active, dynamic, developmental. The Anunnaki were learning about the planet they were organizing. They were mapping its rhythms, its resources, its potentials. They were conducting what we would call science, though they had different frameworks and different language for what they were doing. Astronomy, agriculture, medicine, engineering. Each domain required vast timescales to master. Each discipline needed millennia of observation, experiment, failure, and refinement. And each king in the list represents an epoch during which specific knowledge was being developed. This is why the king list preserves their names, not because they were individuals, though they might have been understood that way by later generations, but because each name encoded a specific body of knowledge, a specific phase of development, a specific aspect of the work that prepared Earth for human habitation. When the Sumerians copied the king list generation after generation, they were preserving more than just names and numbers. They were preserving a curriculum, a record of what had been learned in what order, over what timescales, a testament to the accumulated knowledge that made their own civilization possible. And they placed it at the beginning of their histories because it was the beginning. Not the beginning of human rulership, but the beginning of organized existence on Earth, the foundation upon which everything else was built. We read it as mythology because we can't imagine projects spanning hundreds of thousands of years. Our civilizations are too brief, our own recorded history too short. We think in decades, perhaps centuries. The idea of intentional work continuing across geological epochs feels impossible, But if you're not human, if you operate on different timescales, if your existence isn't measured in decades but in astronomical cycles, then projects spanning hundreds of thousands of years become conceivable, become logical, become the only way to accomplish certain goals. Terraforming a planet takes time. Establishing stable ecosystems takes time. Mapping celestial mechanics takes time. Developing comprehensive knowledge of biology, chemistry, medicine, agriculture, architecture, and every other domain necessary for advanced civilization takes time. The King List tells us how much time: 456,000 years, 18 distinct phases, each phase contributing specific knowledge, specific systems, specific preparations. And then, when the work was complete, when the planet was ready, when all the knowledge had been accumulated and all the systems established, humanity was created, made to inherit what had been prepared, made to maintain what had been built, made to continue the work. This is what the King List reveals when you read it as documentation rather than mythology. The Anunnaki weren't idle gods lounging in divine perfection. They were working, organizing, preparing. For an immense span of time measured in geological epochs, and every bit of knowledge, every system, every technique that the Sumerians possessed, every element of their impossible sophistication that appeared without developmental stages, was inherited from that work, passed down from the age before humans, preserved across the catastrophe that ended the pre-flood world. The clay speaks, the mathematics confirms, the names encode. 18 epochs, 456,000 years. The work that made us possible, the Anunnaki were here before us, preparing the world so that when we finally arrived, we would have something to inherit. That's what they were doing. That's what the King List documents. That's what we've spent over a century refusing to accept. But the testimony remains, pressed into clay, preserved across millennia, waiting for us to finally understand. The work happened, the preparation was real, the inheritance is ours. And now, perhaps, we're finally ready to acknowledge where it came from. But there's one more layer, one more element that makes the King List even more extraordinary. Because the 18 pre-flood kings don't just represent accumulated knowledge. They represent something else, something the text states explicitly, but that we've consistently missed because we're reading with modern assumptions. The text doesn't say these 18 kings were human. It doesn't say they were like us. It very specifically says they were different, other Anunnaki. And when you examine what that term actually means in Sumerian, when you trace how it's used across thousands of texts, you discover something remarkable. The Anunnaki weren't gods in the way we typically understand divinity. They were administrators, managers, a bureaucratic class tasked with organizing and maintaining reality itself. The word Anunnaki breaks down as Anunnaki, offspring of Anu, descendants of heaven. The term defines them by origin rather than by nature. They come from somewhere else. They descended to earth from the heavenly realm. They arrived to do specific work. And across Sumerian literature, they're consistently portrayed not as creators, not as all-powerful cosmic forces, but as workers, as beings with specific jobs, specific responsibilities, specific domains they're tasked with maintaining. Enki manages fresh water and wisdom. Enlil controls storms and agriculture. Ninhursag oversees birth and fertility. Utu governs the sun's course and justice. Nana supervises the moon and timekeeping. Each has a portfolio. Each has specific duties. Each reports to higher authorities within the divine hierarchy. This is bureaucracy. Organizational management, the kind of administrative structure you'd need to run a planet, and the King List documents when that administrative structure was established. 18 phases, 18 different focuses. 18 epochs during which specific aspects of planetary organization were implemented. The first kings established the basic infrastructure: Rivers, coastlines, climate patterns. The Middle Kings developed biological systems, agriculture, animal husbandry, medicine. The later kings refined knowledge systems, astronomy, mathematics, architecture. By the time the 18 epochs concluded, by the time 456,000 years of work had been completed, Earth was ready. The planet was organized, the systems were functional, the knowledge base was complete, and that's when the flood happened. Not as divine punishment, not as angry gods destroying their creation, but as a natural catastrophe, a geological event, the kind of thing that happens on planets periodically, especially during transitions between ice ages. The King list records it factually. The flood swept over. 5 words, no elaboration, no theological explanation, just documentation. Something happened. Water came, the pre-flood age ended, and when kingship was lowered from heaven again, when the Anunnaki returned after the catastrophe subsided, they found a world transformed. The coastlines had shifted, the river courses had changed, the cities had been buried under meters of silt. Everything they'd built over 456,000 years had been damaged or destroyed. They needed labor to rebuild. They needed workers to repair the infrastructure, to re-establish the systems, to restore what had been lost. And that's when humanity was created, not before the flood, after it, to help with the restoration. This is what the Atrahasis epic describes, the creation of humans following divine labor disputes, the gods complaining that the work of maintaining the world had become too burdensome. The decision to create substitute workers who could handle the physical labor, while the Anunnaki focused on management and oversight. We've always read Atrahasis as creation mythology. But what if it's post-flood history? What if humanity was created specifically to help rebuild after catastrophe? What if we're a restoration workforce, brought into existence to repair a damaged planet, to maintain systems that predated us by hundreds of thousands of years? That would explain everything about Sumerian civilization, why it appeared fully formed, why they possessed knowledge they shouldn't have had time to develop, why their mathematics, astronomy, medicine, agriculture, and architecture were so sophisticated from the beginning. They inherited it all from the Anunnaki, from those who had been organizing the planet for 18 epochs before the flood, from managers who returned after the waters receded and needed help restoring what had been damaged. The Sumerians weren't inventing civilization, they were rebuilding it, under Anunnaki instruction, following plans that had been established long before humans existed. This is why their texts consistently say knowledge was given, why they describe divine teachers, why they credit the Anunnaki with establishing everything from writing to irrigation. Because it's true, not metaphorically, literally. The Anunnaki possessed knowledge accumulated over 456,000 years of planetary management. Humans possessed nothing. We'd just been created. We were blank slates. So they taught us. They shared what we needed to know to help with the restoration. They gave us the tools, techniques, and knowledge necessary to rebuild the world. And the Sumerians, understanding themselves as inheritors rather than inventors, recorded that relationship honestly. They credited the Anunnaki. They preserved the king list, showing what came before humans. They maintained the chronology, documenting how long the pre-human work had taken, because forgetting would be catastrophic. Losing the knowledge of how things were supposed to function, how systems were supposed to operate, what the original designs had been, would make restoration impossible. So they wrote it down. They preserved it. They treated it as the most important information they possessed. This is what the king list is. It's not mythology. It's not symbolic literature. It's a technical document, a chronology of planetary organization. A record of the work that happened before humans, preserved because that work mattered, because understanding what came before was essential to maintaining what we'd inherited. The Anunnaki were here first, for 456,000 years, organizing, learning, preparing. The flood interrupted their work. Humanity was created to help resume it. And the Sumerians documented all of this with administrative precision because they understood exactly what they were, what we are. Restoration workers, inheritors of systems we didn't create, maintainers of knowledge we didn't develop, servants of a project that began long before we existed and that we're still tasked with continuing. The King List tells us that, explicitly, in numbers that encode more truth than we've been willing to accept. 456,000 years, 18 epochs, the work before humans. And now, finally, we know what the Anunnaki were doing all that time, preparing the world for us. The silence in the archive is complete. No footsteps in distant halls, no hum of ventilation, just stillness. And in that stillness, the clay tablets breathe with the weight of what they preserve. Imagine being the scribe who first committed the King List to clay, not the scribe at Nippur in 2100 BCE who copied the version we now possess, but the original recorder. The first person to take oral tradition, memorize chronology, accumulated memory of the age before humans, and press it into permanent form. That scribe lived sometime around 3,000 years before the Common Era, during the early dynastic period, when Sumerian city-states were consolidating power and writing was still a relatively new technology. They had a decision to make. How to preserve knowledge that had been passed down through generations, through centuries, through millennia of oral transmission. They could have preserved it as poetry, as epic narrative, as theological allegory. Those formats existed. The Sumerians knew how to write myths, how to compose hymns, how to create literature that expressed truth symbolically. But they didn't choose those formats for the King List. They chose bureaucracy. They chose the format used for tax records, for census documents, for administrative accounts: name, city, reign length, next. The driest, most factual, most unglamorous format available. Why? Because they were recording facts. They were documenting chronology. They were preserving information that needed to be accurate, not beautiful. Information that future generations would need to reference, to verify, to continue building upon. The King List was meant to function, not to inspire or entertain, but to inform, to provide concrete data about what came before, to establish the timeline against which all subsequent history would be measured. And it worked. The document was copied for over 2,000 years. Every major Sumerian and later Babylonian city maintained versions. Scribes treated it as foundational. Kings referenced it to legitimize their rule. Scholars studied it to understand origins. It became the chronological backbone of Mesopotamian civilization, the document that defined when time began, when kingship first descended, when humanity inherited the organized world. And it has survived. Through the collapse of Sumer, through the rise and fall of Babylon and Assyria, through the extinction of cuneiform writing and the death of the languages that used it, through 2 millennia of burial beneath sand and rubble, through excavation, translation, and scholarly debate. The King List endures. Multiple copies in multiple museums, its text available online for anyone to read, its numbers preserved exactly as the original scribe recorded them over 5,000 years ago, 456,000 years, 18 kings, the age before the flood. That scribe pressing wedge marks into wet clay, creating the document we now study, couldn't have imagined us. Couldn't have conceived of a world 5,000 years in the future where people speaking languages that didn't exist yet would read those numbers and argue about what they meant. But they hoped someone would remember. They hoped the information would survive. They hoped future generations would understand that before humans ruled, others were here, doing work that made our existence possible, organizing the planet across spans of time that humans could barely comprehend. They pressed those hopes into clay, and the clay remembered. Now, in archives across the world, scholars continue to debate what the King List means, how to interpret the impossible numbers, whether to trust the chronology or dismiss it as mythology, whether the pre-flood section has any historical value or whether it's purely symbolic literature. But the debates miss something essential. The Sumerians themselves had no doubt. They treated the King List as history. They copied it as fact. They referenced it as truth. They built their entire chronological framework upon it, understanding themselves as inheritors of a world organized during the age the list documented. We're the ones who doubt. We're the ones who insist it must mean something other than what it says. We're the ones who reinterpret, who explain away, who translate impossible numbers into symbolic meanings, because accepting them as documentation would shatter our models of human origins. But what if the Sumerians were right? What if their testimony, preserved with such care across such vast spans of time, is accurate? What if they really were recording what happened before humans? What if the Anunnaki really did organize Earth across 456,000 years of pre-human work? The implications are staggering. It means human civilization isn't a recent invention. It's a restoration of something much older. It means our knowledge, our techniques, our sophisticated understanding of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and engineering isn't the product of 10,000 years of human development. It's inherited from teachers who possess knowledge accumulated across geological epochs. It means we're not the first, we're not even the second, we're the latest iteration in a story that stretches back almost 500,000 years. A story of planetary organization, catastrophic interruption, and ongoing restoration. It means the Anunnaki, whether we understand them as gods, as advanced beings, as administrators from elsewhere, or as something we don't yet have words for, were real. They were here. They did the work the texts describe. They established the foundations upon which everything else was built. And it means the flood, the catastrophe that divided before from after, was the defining moment in that long story. The event that ended one age and began another. The reason why the Sumerians and every other ancient culture divide history into pre-flood and post-flood periods. Because the flood was real. It happened. It reset everything. And what came after was reconstruction, restoration, rebuilding based on memories of what had existed before. The King List documents all of this, with mathematical precision, with administrative thoroughness, with bureaucratic accuracy. Not as mythology, but as testimony. And we're finally, after over a century of translation and study, after decades of archaeological confirmation that the flood layers exist and that Sumerian civilization appeared mysteriously complete, beginning to understand what that testimony means. The Anunnaki were doing exactly what the texts say they were doing before humans. They were organizing a planet across 456,000 years in 18 distinct phases, preparing Earth for the creation, arrival or emergence of humanity. And when we appeared, we inherited their work. We became the maintenance crew for systems we didn't build. We learned from teachers who possessed knowledge we didn't develop. We took over a project that began long before we existed. That's what the King List reveals. That's what the Sumerians recorded. That's what we've spent over a century refusing to accept. But the clay doesn't lie. The numbers don't lie. The testimony stands. 456,000 years, the age before humans, the work of the Anunnaki. And now, at last, we know. The archive breathes, the tablets rest, and somewhere in the darkness, a scribe from 5,000 years ago has finally been heard. They did their job. They preserved the memory. They made sure we would know. even if it took us this long to listen. In the deepening quiet, as the weight of millennia settles around us, we're left with questions that won't resolve cleanly. Questions that the king list poses but doesn't answer. Questions that demand we reconsider everything we thought we knew about where we came from and why we're here. If the Anunnaki organized Earth for 456,000 years before humans existed, what happened to them? Where did they go? Are they still here, watching, overseeing, ensuring we maintain what they established? Or did they leave, their work complete, their presence no longer necessary once humanity could manage independently? The Sumerian texts offer hints, but no clear answers. Some texts describe the Anunnaki retreating to the heavens after humanity's creation, ascending to their original realm, leaving only occasional representatives to guide human kings and instruct temple priests. Other texts suggest they remain present but hidden, operating behind the scenes, intervening only when absolutely necessary. The king list itself goes silent after the flood. Post-flood kingship is lowered from heaven again, suggesting Anunnaki involvement in re-establishing human rulership. But the text no longer names Anunnaki as kings. Instead, it lists human rulers, suggesting a transition, a handover of power from those who organize the planet to those who would maintain it. Perhaps that's the answer. The Anunnaki's work was preparation. Once humanity was created and trained, once we demonstrated capacity to maintain what they'd built, they stepped back, not abandoning us, but allowing us to assume responsibility, graduating us from students to stewards. But if that's true, if we're now the caretakers of systems established over 456,000 years of pre-human work, then we carry an enormous responsibility. We're not free to do whatever we wish with the planet. We're inheritors of a trust, maintainers of something that predates us by geological epochs. Servants of a project we didn't initiate, but that we're now tasked with continuing. The Sumerians understood this. Their entire civilization was structured around that understanding. They saw themselves as servants of the gods, yes, but not in a degrading sense, in the sense of continuing important work, work that mattered, work that connected them to something vast and ancient and purposeful. The kings claimed legitimacy by demonstrating they were worthy continuers of what the Anunnaki had established. Their priests maintained temples as centers of cosmic order, ensuring the systems established in the pre-flood age continued functioning properly. Their scribes preserved knowledge, including the king list, because forgetting origins would mean losing understanding of purpose. Modern civilization has largely abandoned that framework. We see ourselves as independent, as masters of our own destiny, as inventors rather than inheritors. We claim our achievements as purely human, developed through our own ingenuity, unconnected to anything that came before. But what if that's hubris? What if our refusal to acknowledge inheritance blinds us to responsibility? What if treating the planet as ours to exploit, rather than ours to maintain, is a catastrophic misunderstanding of our actual role? The king list whispers a different story. A humbler story, a story where we're not the beginning but the continuation, where we're not creators but custodians, where our purpose isn't to dominate but to preserve, to maintain, to carry forward what was established long before we existed. And perhaps that's the real reason the Sumerians preserved this document, not just to record history, but to remind us. To ensure that no matter how much time passed, no matter how sophisticated we became, we would never forget where we came from and what we're supposed to be doing. 18 epochs, 456,000 years, the work of organizing a planet, the preparation that made our existence possible. The Anunnaki did that work. They spent geological time spans learning Earth's rhythms, mapping its systems, establishing the infrastructure of habitability. They accumulated knowledge we still use. They created stability we still depend upon. They built foundations we still stand upon, and then they gave it to us. Through catastrophe and creation, through flood and rebuilding, through teaching and inheritance, we received what they established. The question now is what we do with that inheritance, whether we honor it or squander it, whether we maintain what we've been given or let it collapse through neglect and ignorance. The King List can't answer that question. It can only remind us that the question exists, that we're not the first beings to organize this planet, that others came before us, worked far longer than we have, established systems far more sophisticated than we've recognized, and that we're standing on their shoulders whether we acknowledge it or not. The clay tablets will continue to rest in their climate-controlled archives. Scholars will continue to debate their meaning. New copies may yet be discovered, buried beneath Iraqi sands, waiting for excavation. The conversation about what the King List means, about whether its chronology can be trusted, about what the Anunnaki really were, will continue for generations. But the testimony remains constant, unchanged by debate, unaffected by skepticism. The numbers are there, the names are preserved, the chronology is recorded, 456,000 years before the flood. 18 epochs of planetary organization, the work of the Anunnaki, the foundation of everything that came after. And we are the inheritors, the continuers, the ones who received what they prepared. That's what the Sumerian King List reveals. That's what those ancient scribes, pressing wedge marks into wet clay 5,000 years ago, were trying to tell us. And perhaps after all this time, after all this resistance, after all these centuries of insisting, they must have meant something else. We're finally ready to hear them. The work happened. The preparation was real. The inheritance is ours. And the responsibility is ours too, to remember, to maintain, to continue. That's what the Anunnaki were doing before humans, and that's what we're supposed to be doing now. The clay speaks, the numbers testify, the chronology stands. 456,000 years, 18 epochs, the age before us. May we prove worthy of what we've inherited. The night deepens, the silence becomes complete. And in that silence, across vast distances of time and space, the message reaches us at last. We are not the beginning, we are the continuation, and the work is not finished. Before you drift away into sleep, carrying these ancient mysteries with you into dreams, take a moment to consider what we've explored together tonight. The Sumerian King List, that small clay prism preserved across 5 millennia, has given us a gift more valuable than gold or gems. It's given us memory. Memory of what came before humans. Memory of work that spanned geological epochs. Memory of preparation that made our existence possible. The Anunnaki, whatever they were, however we choose to understand them, did something extraordinary. They organized a planet. They spent 456,000 years learning its rhythms, mapping its systems, accumulating knowledge that would eventually be passed to us. They worked in 18 phases, each epoch contributing specific understanding, each period establishing specific foundations. And then catastrophe came. The flood that swept over, that buried cities under meters of silt, that reset everything. But even catastrophe couldn't erase what had been learned. The knowledge survived, preserved in memory, encoded in tradition, eventually written into clay by scribes who understood its importance. We are the inheritors of that knowledge. Every time we use base 60 mathematics to measure time, every time we plant crops according to seasonal cycles, every time we build structures aligned to celestial events, every time we treat illnesses with plant-based medicines, we're using knowledge accumulated across those 456,000 years of pre-human work. The Sumerians knew this. They recorded it plainly. They preserved the chronology faithfully. They hoped future generations would remember. And now, 5,000 years after they pressed those words into clay, We're finally beginning to understand what they were telling us. If you found value in this exploration, if it changed how you think about human origins and our place in the long story of planetary organization, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what resonated with you, what questions linger, what elements of the King list intrigue you most, and tell me where you are as you listen to this. What time is it in your corner of the world? Are you drifting towards sleep, or have these ideas energized your mind? There's something profound about knowing we're scattered across the globe, united by curiosity about the same ancient mysteries, listening to the same testimony from clay tablets that have been silent for thousands of years. The archive will close soon. The lights will dim. The tablets will rest in their padded drawers, waiting for tomorrow's scholars, tomorrow's questions, tomorrow's attempts to understand what the Sumerians recorded 5,000 years ago. But the testimony doesn't sleep. The numbers don't rest. The chronology remains constant, 456,000 years, 18 epochs, the work of the Anunnaki, the age before humans, the preparation that made everything possible. That scribe at Nippur, pressing stylus to clay in 2100 BCE, copying a text already ancient when they recorded it, left fingerprints in the wet clay. Those prints are still there, preserved across 41 centuries. The ridges and whorls of a hand that hasn't existed for 4,000 years, frozen in the moment of transmission. That scribe was passing something forward, taking memory from the past and ensuring it reached the future, building a bridge across time using nothing but clay and care and the understanding that some things matter too much to forget. We're standing on the far end of that bridge now, looking back across 5,000 years at that scribe, across 5,000 more years of oral tradition before the text was written, across the catastrophe of the flood, across the 456,000 years of pre-human work that the King list documents. And we can see clearly, perhaps for the first time, what they were trying to show us. We are not the first. We are not the beginning. We are the continuation of something vastly older, vastly longer, vastly more purposeful than we've allowed ourselves to believe. The Anunnaki came before us. They worked before us. They prepared before us for 456,000 years. And then they gave us the planet they'd organized, the systems they'd established, the knowledge they'd accumulated. We inherited a world, not a wild world that we had to civilize from scratch, but an organized world, a prepared world, a world ready for us. That's what the Sumerian King list reveals. That's what those 18 pre-flood kings represent. That's what those impossible numbers encode. The age of preparation, the epochs of organization, the work that made everything else possible. And now, as the night deepens and sleep approaches, as your mind drifts toward dreams carrying these ancient mysteries with you, rest in this knowledge. You are part of something ancient, something purposeful, something that stretches back almost 500,000 years. You are an inheritor, a continuer, a carrier of work that began long before your species existed. The Anunnaki organized the planet. The flood interrupted their work. Humanity was created to help restore it. The Sumerians documented it all, and now you know, 456,000 years, 18 epochs, the work before humans. May that knowledge bring you peace. May it bring you purpose. May it bring you understanding of your place in the vast story that the clay tablets preserve. Sleep well, dream deeply, and remember, you are standing on foundations laid across geological time. You are using knowledge accumulated across astronomical epochs. You are inheriting systems established before your ancestors' existed. The work of the Anunnaki surrounds you still, in the cycles of seasons, in the movements of stars, in the knowledge that lets you measure time, grow food, build structures and heal illness. They prepared this world for 456,000 years, for us, and the clay remembers. The numbers testify. The chronology stands. Good night. And may the ancient mysteries carry you gently into sleep, knowing that you are part of something far older and far grander than you were taught to believe. The Anunnaki were here first, doing the work that made us possible, and their legacy surrounds us still. Rest well in that knowledge. The clay has spoken, and we have finally learned to listen. The tablets rest, but their message continues to unfold, because there's more hidden in the king list than we've yet explored. Details so subtle they're easy to miss, patterns so precise they reveal something extraordinary about how the Anunnaki actually organized their work across those 456,000 years. Look again at the distribution of the 18 pre-flood kings across the 5 cities. Not random, not arbitrary, deliberate. Eridu receives 8 kings, Bad Tibira receives 3, Larak receives 1, Sippar receives 1, Shurupak receives 1. The remaining 4 kings are distributed among other centers whose names have been partially lost to damage in some tablet versions. 8 kings in Eridu. 8 epochs, 8 complete phases of work concentrated in the oldest, most sacred city. The city where kingship first descended from heaven, the city built over the Abzu, the cosmic freshwater ocean. The city whose temple foundations were described as laid in the sacred place, carried forward from distant days. Why 8? Why concentrate so much of the pre-flood chronology in one location? The number 8 held profound significance in Mesopotamian mathematics and cosmology. 8 is 2 cubed. 8 represents dimensional completion, the full expression of 3-dimensional space doubled into time. 8 is the number of cosmic gates in some temple texts, the points of transition between realms. 8 is structurally perfect in base 60 mathematics, dividing cleanly into the Shah unit. The 8 kings of Eridu might represent the 8 fundamental phases of planetary organization, the 8 essential systems that needed to be established before anything else could proceed. Water management, climate stabilization, biological seeding, atmospheric regulation, geological mapping, resource identification, seasonal establishment, temporal calibration. Each king, each epoch, focused on one of these fundamentals. Each Shah cycle, each astronomical period measured in the thousands of years, marked the completion of one phase and the beginning of the next. By the time the 8th king of Eridu completed his work, the foundational systems were in place. The planet was ready for the next phase. Bad Tibira receives 3 kings, 3 epochs, 3 additional phases building upon Eridu's foundations. Bad Tibira's name means Fortress of the Metalworkers. Its specialty was metallurgy, the transformation of raw ore into useful tools. Its 3 kings might represent the development of technological knowledge, the discovery of copper, bronze, and the complex chemistry of smelting and alloying. Why 3 kings? Why 3 epochs for metallurgical development? Because metals are complicated. Finding ore deposits requires geological survey. Extracting metal from ore requires understanding heat, chemistry, reduction processes. Working metal into useful forms requires experimentation with techniques, temperatures, cooling rates, and each metal behaves differently. Copper is soft and workable. Bronze is harder but brittle. Understanding the full spectrum of metallurgical possibility takes time, takes multiple phases, takes 3 epochs. Larak receives 1 king, 1 epoch. Ensipad Ana, whose name connects to healing. Larak specialized in medicine, in understanding the biological systems of earthly life. One complete Shah cycle devoted to mapping every plant, every mineral, every treatment for every ailment. 28,800 years of systematic pharmacological research. That's not excessive, that's barely sufficient. Earth's biosphere contains millions of species of plants alone. Each species contains dozens or hundreds of chemical compounds. Some heal, some harm, some are neutral, some work in combination, but not in isolation. Some are safe at low doses, but toxic at high doses. Mapping all of that, testing all of it, understanding all the interactions, genuinely requires millennia. Encypadziana's epoch represents that comprehensive survey. By the time his phase concluded, by the time that Shah's cycle completed, medical knowledge was established. The Anunnaki understood what worked, what didn't, what combinations were safe, what doses were effective. And that knowledge would eventually be passed to human physicians, becoming the Sumerian medical texts that modern pharmacology has confirmed actually work. Sipar receives one king, Enmendur-Ana, who the texts say ascended to heaven to receive wisdom about the stars. Sipar specialized in astronomy, in understanding celestial mechanics, one epoch devoted to mapping the sky, 21,000 years of continuous observation. Again, not excessive. Astronomical cycles are long. The precession of the equinoxes takes 25,920 years. You can't understand precession from short observation periods. You need to watch for the full cycle. You need continuous records spanning the entire period. You need institutions maintaining observations across timescales that dwarf human lifetimes. Enmendur-Ana's epoch provided that time. His Shah cycle was the observation period. And the knowledge accumulated during those 21,000 years became the foundation of Mesopotamian astronomy. The ability to predict eclipses, the understanding of planetary motions, the recognition of cyclic patterns in celestial events. All inherited from that observational epoch. Shuruppak receives one king, Ubar-Tutu, whose son Ziusudra would survive the flood. Shuruppak was the last pre-flood city to receive kingship, the final phase before catastrophe. Ubar-Tutu's reign spans 18,600 years, slightly more than 5 Shah cycles. His epoch represents culmination, completion, the final preparations before the work concluded. What was being completed? What final phase did Shuruppak represent? The text suggests administrative integration. Shuruppak was where records were kept, where knowledge from all the other cities was compiled, where the accumulated wisdom of the previous epochs was synthesized into comprehensive understanding. Ubar-Tutu's era was the age of documentation, of taking everything learned across the previous 437,400 years and organizing it, codifying it, preparing it for transmission. Because by then, the Anunnaki knew something was coming: geological instability, climate shifts, the signs of impending catastrophe that would eventually manifest as the flood. They needed to preserve knowledge before it was lost. They needed to ensure that whatever survived the coming disaster could rebuild based on what had been learned. They needed to create records that would endure, and they did. Those records became oral tradition, transmitted through survivors, eventually written into clay when humans developed writing, finally preserved as the texts we now study. The king list, the creation myths, the astronomical tables, the medical prescriptions, the mathematical treatises, all echoes of knowledge originally accumulated during those 18 pre-flood epochs. The distribution pattern reveals intentional sequencing, foundation phases in Eridu, technological development in Bad Tibira, biological knowledge in Larak, astronomical mapping in Sipar, administrative compilation in Shuruppak, each city specializing, each epoch contributing, each phase building upon previous accomplishments. This is project management on a geological timescale. This is organized development spanning astronomical periods. This is intentional preparation executed with precision across 456,000 years. The Anunnaki weren't randomly exploring Earth, they were systematically organizing it, following a plan, achieving specific milestones, completing definable phases, working toward a goal, and the goal was us. Or rather, the goal was creating conditions where beings like us could exist and thrive, where civilization was possible, where accumulated knowledge could be applied, where the planet functioned reliably enough that intelligent life could build upon its systems rather than struggling constantly against chaos. They succeeded. By the time the 18th epoch concluded, by the time Ubatutu's reign ended and the flood swept over, the work was done. Earth was ready. The systems functioned. The knowledge existed. All that remained was transmission. The flood complicated that transmission. It destroyed the physical infrastructure. It buried the cities. It killed most of those who carried the knowledge. But enough survived. Enough memory remained. And when humanity was created in the aftermath, when we emerged to help rebuild what had been damaged, the Anunnaki taught us what we needed to know, not everything. We didn't receive the full depth of knowledge accumulated across 18 epochs. We received the essential elements, the practical techniques, the foundational understanding, enough to maintain the systems, enough to continue the work, enough to be useful inheritors. And we accepted that inheritance. The Sumerians built their civilization on it. They used the mathematics, the astronomy, the medicine, the agriculture, the architecture. They maintained the temples, honored the systems, preserved the knowledge. They understood themselves as continuers of something that began long before them. That understanding shows in how they structured their own society. Sumerian cities mirrored the pre-flood pattern. Each specialized, each contributed specific knowledge to the collective whole. Uruk focused on kingship and literature. Nippur maintained religious authority and scribal education. Ur developed trade and maritime knowledge. Lagash perfected irrigation engineering. Each city had its domain, its specialty, its contribution. Just like the 5 pre-flood cities, each with specific focus, each contributing to the overall project. The Sumerians were replicating a pattern they'd inherited, organizing their civilization according to principles established during the age before humans. This wasn't conscious mimicry, it was cultural memory, deep structural understanding that certain organizational patterns worked. That specialization and cooperation produced better results than isolation and competition. That long-term projects required patient systematic development across generations. The Anunnaki had demonstrated those principles across 456,000 years of successful planetary organization. The Sumerians inherited the demonstration and applied its lessons to their own civilization. And they succeeded. For over 1,000 years, Sumerian culture flourished. Cities grew. Knowledge accumulated. Architecture became increasingly sophisticated. Art reached remarkable heights. Literature explored profound themes. They succeeded because they were building on solid foundations. Foundations laid across 18 epochs. Foundations established by those who came before. Foundations the king list documents with such precision that we can still read the chronology 5,000 years later. 456,000 years. 18 kings, 18 epochs, 18 phases of work that prepared a planet for habitable civilization. The distribution pattern reveals the plan. The mathematical precision confirms intentionality. The archaeological evidence shows the results. The flood interrupted but didn't destroy. Humanity inherited and continued. The Sumerians recorded and preserved, and now we know. We finally understand what those 18 pre-flood kings represent. Not individuals who lived impossible lifespans, but epochs of organized development, phases of systematic preparation, periods during which specific knowledge was accumulated and specific systems were established. The Anunnaki's work across those epochs made everything possible, made our existence possible, made civilization possible, made the inheritance possible that the Sumerians received and that we continue to benefit from. That's what the distribution pattern shows. That's what the king list preserves. That's what 5,000 years of careful copying and transmission has given us. A map, a chronology, a record of intentional preparation spanning geological time. Documentation of work we didn't do, but that we inherited. Testimony of those who came before, who organized, who prepared, who made ready. The clay speaks, the pattern reveals, the chronology stands. 18 epochs across 5 cities, specialized development producing comprehensive knowledge. 456,000 years of work before humans existed. The Anunnaki were here first, doing exactly what the texts say they were doing, organizing a planet, preparing it for us. And the distribution pattern across those 5 cities proves the work was real, intentional, systematic, successful. We are standing on those foundations still.